We usually picture witch hunts as a kind of chaotic outbreak, an explosion of superstition and mass hysteria. The image is familiar. A frenzied mob with pitchforks and torches driven by a fanatical preacher dragging some poor old woman to trial, her only crime being knowledge of herbs or the misfortune of owning a black cat. That picture isn't wrong, but it hides a darker and far more cynical reality. The great European witch hunts, at their height between about 1560 and 1660, were not just the product of irrational fear. In many places, they became a tightly run, bureaucratic, and most importantly, profitable enterprise. It was a machine fueled by human fear, but greased by money. Where a denunciation was an investment, torture was a paid service, and confiscation of property was the ultimate payoff. To understand how this was possible, we have to look past the rhetoric of religious zeal and examine the cold, calculated interests that drove the machinery forward. This didn't come out of nowhere. Late medieval and early modern Europe was an anxious, unstable place. The Little Ice Age brought long winters, damp summers, crop failures, and famine. Epidemics, some echoes of the Black Death, along with new diseases, decimated populations. And religious wars, unleashed by the Reformation, split societies into bitter camps, breeding an atmosphere where every neighbor could be suspected of being an agent of the enemy. In such a world of constant disaster, people demanded a simple answer to the question, who's to blame? That answer was supplied. The 1486 publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, Hummer of Witches, gave Europe more than a book. It provided a manual. It codified fear into a systematic demonology, turning scattered folklore into a legal and theological framework. It taught judges and officials that evil had human carriers, witches who had made a pact with the devil and now lived only to harm good Christians. On this soil of fear and suspicion grew the economics of the witch trial. It wasn't a single centralized system, but a patchwork of local practices, especially in the fragmented Holy Roman Empire, where hundreds of tiny states, bishoprics, and cities ran their own courts. There, the system was refined into something terrifyingly efficient. From the moment someone was accused, they or their family had to foot the bill for every step of their journey to the scaffold. It started with the accusation. Motives for informing were rarely purely religious. Denunciations were weapons, tools for debt relief, revenge, or social advancement. A debtor could eliminate his creditor, a jealous farmer could remove a competitor, a rejected suitor could destroy the woman who spurned him. Midwives and herbal healers, often women with real medical knowledge, were prime targets for university-trained male physicians eager to wipe out competition. Communities themselves used accusations as a form of social housekeeping, clearing out widows, beggars, or simply troublesome individuals. In some regions, informants were rewarded with a cut of the confiscated property, creating a direct financial incentive to hunt for witches among one's neighbors. Once an accusation was accepted, the financial trap snapped shut. The accused paid for everything: guards' services during arrest, their own food and lodging in prison, even the shackles that bound them. Jailers charged extra fees for minor comforts. The longer the trial dragged on, the deeper the debt grew. But the real money was made in the torture chamber. Executioners were skilled tradesmen with detailed rate sheets preserved in city records, showing the instruments had one price. Crushing bones with the Spanish boot had another. Stretching someone on the rack was billed separately. Every tool, every hour, every assistant's labor was added to the tab. The cruel irony was clear. The stronger a prisoner's will, the longer they resisted, and the larger the bill their family would inherit. When a broken soul finally confessed to flying to Sabbaths, striking pacts with Satan, or blighting cattle, the trial wound toward its conclusion. But the bills kept rolling in. Judges collected daily wages, scribes recorded testimony in careful script, priests were paid for offering spiritual consolation before execution. The execution itself wasn't free either. Families received a final itemized bill. Executioners charged different rates depending on the method. Beheading by sword was pricier than hanging. Burning alive was most expensive of all, requiring fuel, straw, ropes, and sometimes a bag of gunpowder tied around the condemned's neck, an extra charge, ironically justified as an act of mercy. After the execution, officials often celebrated with a banquet to mark the purging of the community's evil. The cost of this feast, too, went to the victim's family. If they couldn't pay, which was almost always the case, the authorities confiscated and auctioned off their house, land, livestock, and possessions. This wasn't incidental corruption, it was a system. It created whole classes of beneficiaries. Local rulers, princes, bishops, magistrates, grew their treasuries with seized property. In the bishoprics of Bamberg and Würzburg during the 1620s, witch trials ballooned into mass purges that swallowed not only the poor, but wealthy merchants, council members, and widows. The mayor of Bamberg, Johannes Junius, burned in 1628, smuggled a letter to his daughter. Innocent, I came to prison. Innocent, I was tortured. Innocent, I must die. Whoever enters this dungeon must become a witch or be tortured until he invents lies. Church authorities also profited, particularly in Catholic lands, collecting their share while reinforcing spiritual authority. Judges, clerks, lawyers, and minor officials, the middle class of the witch industry, depended on the constant flow of cases for their salaries and prestige. Some turned it into a traveling business. The most infamous was Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled Witchfinder General in Civil War era England. Neither judge nor priest, Hopkins was essentially a consultant who, for a hefty fee, would descend on a town, root out witches, and hand them over for execution. He charged daily rates, per-witch fees, and expenses, building a fortune in under 2 years while sending hundreds to their deaths. He wasn't a zealot so much as an entrepreneur of terror. Even at the lowest rungs, people profited. Executioners sold grisly souvenirs, ropes from hangings as good luck charms, body parts as ingredients for folk medicine. Jailers extorted families for food deliveries or visitation rights. The system was so effective that it eventually devoured itself. In areas of heavy persecution, entire villages were gutted of their working populations. When the accusations began to reach into the wealthier and more powerful classes, elites realized the blade could swing their way too. What began as a tool of control turned into a genuine threat to their own survival. By the late 17th century, the great wave of witch trials began to recede. Stronger centralized states like France started pulling trials into royal courts, imposing stricter rules of evidence and curtailing torture. The Enlightenment brought rationalism and skepticism. Jurists, scholars, and philosophers increasingly condemned the trials as barbaric relics. And there was another reason: economic exhaustion. A system that lived off destruction and confiscation was doomed to collapse once there was nothing left to seize. The story of the witch hunts is not only a tragedy of superstition, it is also a chilling example of how fear can be monetized. This was a system where ideology, bureaucracy, and greed fused into a single lethal engine. People burned not only because their neighbors believed in the devil, but because their deaths paid salaries, filled treasuries, and kept the machinery turning. The stake wasn't just a symbol of justice or purification, it was the final step in a long financial transaction. And that realization may be more frightening than the darkest tales of Sabbaths and sorcery, for it speaks not of demons from hell, but of the ones inside human hearts, ready to build a business empire out of suffering.